At my sister's wedding, her MIL pointed and proclaimed, "You can stand by the trash. We're out of seats." I surveyed the room and found even their cat got a spot. So I grabbed my gift, smiled, and declared, "Fitting, since that's where this marriage belongs." She came rushing as I proceeded. I, 29M, never expected my sister's wedding day to become a battlefield, but sometimes family drama has a way of exploding when you least expect it. The venue was beautiful, an old estate with manicured gardens and crystal chandeliers hanging from vaulted ceilings. Everything looked perfect on the surface, which made what happened next even more shocking. I arrived fashionably on time, dressed in my best suit, and carrying an expensive gift I'd carefully selected for my sister and her new husband. We'd grown up close, and despite some recent tension in the family, I wanted her day to be special. What I didn't anticipate was walking into what felt like a carefully orchestrated ambush. The ceremony went off without a hitch. My sister looked radiant in her flowing white dress, and her husband-to-be seemed genuinely happy. I sat in the third row, watching them exchange vows, feeling genuinely emotional about this new chapter in her life. The problem started during the reception when we moved inside for dinner. I approached the seating area, scanning the elegantly decorated tables for my assigned spot. Each table had beautiful centerpieces and gold-rimmed place cards, and I assumed I'd find my name somewhere among the family tables near the front. Instead, I wandered around for several minutes, checking every table twice, growing increasingly confused and embarrassed as other guests settled into their seats. That's when she appeared, my sister's new mother-in-law, a woman who'd made her dislike of our family abundantly clear during the engagement period. She was a tall, imposing figure in an expensive navy dress, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She'd been watching me search, I realized, waiting for this exact moment. She approached me with deliberate steps, her voice carrying across the room as she made her announcement. She told me I could stand by the trash cans near the kitchen entrance because they were out of seats. The way she said it, with such casual cruelty, made several nearby guests turn and stare. She wasn't trying to be discreet. This was a public humiliation, carefully planned and perfectly executed. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. The wedding guests around us had gone quiet, sensing the tension. My sister was across the room, talking to her photographer, completely unaware of the drama unfolding. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger, but I forced myself to remain calm and survey the situation. That's when I noticed something that made my blood boil even more. Near the head table, positioned perfectly with its own small cushioned chair and even a tiny place setting, sat their pampered Persian cat. The absurdity of it hit me like a slap. They'd made sure their pet had a comfortable spot at the reception while deliberately excluding me, the bride's brother. I walked over to examine the cat's setup more closely. It had a small silver bowl with its name engraved on it, a velvet cushion, and was positioned where it could see the entire reception. Meanwhile, I was being directed to stand next to the garbage cans like some uninvited crasher. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, or on the other guests who were starting to murmur among themselves. Something inside me snapped. I tried to be diplomatic with this woman throughout the engagement, swallowing her subtle insults and passive-aggressive comments for my sister's sake. But this was beyond the pale. She was using my sister's wedding day to settle whatever score she thought she had with our family, and I wasn't going to stand for it. I walked back to where I'd left my gift on the present table, an expensive crystal vase set that had cost me more than I could really afford. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hands, and turned back toward the seating area where she was still standing, watching me with obvious satisfaction at her handiwork. I raised my voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear and made my own announcement. I told her she was absolutely right about the seating arrangement being fitting, since that's exactly where this marriage belonged, in the trash. The words came out before I could stop them, fueled by years of accumulated resentment and this final, unforgivable insult. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The string quartet seemed to falter in their performance. Even the catering staff paused in their duties to watch the drama unfold. My sister's new mother-in-law's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep crimson. She started moving toward me, her carefully composed facade cracking to reveal genuine fury underneath. She demanded to know how I dared speak to her that way at her son's wedding, her voice rising with each word. I told her I was simply responding to her hospitality with the same level of respect she'd shown me. The gift stayed firmly in my hands as I explained that I wouldn't be leaving it for a couple who thought so little of family that they'd seat their cat before the bride's brother. By now, we'd attracted quite an audience. My sister finally noticed the commotion and started making her way over, her dress rustling as she moved quickly through the crowd. Her husband was right behind her, looking confused and increasingly concerned as he read the room. The mother-in-law tried to regain control of the situation, telling anyone who would listen that I was being unreasonable and causing a scene at her son's special day. She painted herself as the victim, claiming I was making outrageous demands and being disrespectful to the hosts. But the other guests weren't buying it. Several people had witnessed the entire exchange, including the humiliating seating directive and the cat's privileged position. The murmurs around us were growing louder and not in her favor. People were starting to piece together what had really happened, and the social dynamics were shifting rapidly. My sister reached us just as things were getting heated. She asked what was happening, looking back and forth between me and her new mother-in-law with growing alarm. The venue suddenly felt smaller, more charged, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting to see how this would play out. I explained the situation calmly, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I told my sister exactly what had transpired: the missing place card, the trash can directive, the cat's seating arrangement, and my response. I watched her face change as she processed the information, seeing the hurt and disbelief creep into her expression. Her new mother-in-law immediately went on the defensive, claiming there had been a misunderstanding about the seating arrangements. She insisted that I was overreacting and making unreasonable accusations. But her explanations sounded hollow given the evidence everyone had witnessed. My sister turned to look at the cat's elaborate setup, then back at the area by the trash cans where I'd been directed to stand. The contrast was impossible to ignore or explain away. Her wedding day was being ruined not by my reaction, but by the deliberate cruelty that had provoked it. Her husband stepped forward, trying to mediate the situation. He apologized for the confusion and suggested we find a solution that would work for everyone. But I could see in his eyes that he knew this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was his mother asserting dominance on his wedding day, and he was caught in the middle. I made my position clear. I told them I wasn't interested in compromising or finding middle ground with someone who would treat family this way. The gift would stay with me, and I would be leaving immediately. My sister's special day had been poisoned by petty family politics, and continuing to participate would only make things worse. The crowd around us had grown larger, with guests pretending to mingle while obviously eavesdropping on every word. Social media phones were starting to appear, though people were trying to be discreet about it. This was exactly the kind of drama that would be talked about for years, passed down as family legend. My sister looked torn, caught between loyalty to her new husband's family and her relationship with me. She asked me to please stay and work things out, her voice breaking slightly. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and instead it was turning into a nightmare of family conflict. But I'd reached my limit. I told her I loved her and wished her happiness, but I couldn't pretend to celebrate a union that came with such strings attached. The mother-in-law's behavior wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate statement about how our family would be treated going forward. As I turned to leave, the mother-in-law made one final attempt to save face. She called after me, claiming I was being dramatic and ruining everyone's good time over a simple seating mix-up. She suggested I was jealous of my sister's happiness and trying to steal attention on her special day. That accusation stopped me cold. I turned back to face her, feeling a cold clarity settle over me. I told her that if this was how she treated family at celebrations, I could only imagine how she'd behave during the inevitable rough patches that all marriages face. My sister would need real support someday, not someone who played favorites with house pets. The comment hit home harder than I'd expected. Several older relatives nodded approvingly, clearly thinking about their own experiences with difficult in-laws. The younger guests looked uncomfortable but fascinated, like they were watching a particularly intense episode of reality television. My sister's husband finally found his voice and tried to defend his mother, claiming she was nervous about the wedding and didn't mean any harm. But his explanation felt weak even to him. I could tell. He was starting to realize that this pattern of behavior would likely continue throughout his marriage. I wished my sister genuine happiness one final time and walked toward the exit, still carrying the wedding gift. The crowd parted to let me through, and I could feel dozens of eyes following my movement. This wasn't how I'd planned to spend the evening, but sometimes standing up for yourself requires making difficult choices. As I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. My sister had followed me, her dress trail rustling against the floor. She caught up just as I stepped outside, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. We stood there in the garden, with the sounds of the reception continuing inside. Update 1. She asked me to please reconsider, explaining that she'd had no idea about the seating situation and that she'd fix everything immediately. But I could see the doubt creeping into her expression. This wasn't the first time her new mother-in-law had caused problems, just the most public. I reminded her of the incidents during the engagement period, the passive-aggressive comments about our family's background, the deliberate exclusions from planning events, the subtle ways she tried to minimize our importance in my sister's life. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months of calculated disrespect. My sister admitted she'd noticed the pattern but had hoped things would improve after the wedding. She'd been trying to keep the peace, not wanting to start her marriage with family conflict. But now she was seeing how naive that hope had been. We talked for several minutes in the garden, away from the crowd inside. She told me about other incidents I hadn't known about, times when her future mother-in-law had made cutting remarks about our family's finances, our education, our social standing. It painted a clear picture of systematic exclusion disguised as wedding planning. I told her I understood her position and didn't blame her for trying to navigate an impossible situation. But I also explained that I couldn't enable this behavior by pretending it was acceptable. Someone needed to draw a line, even if it meant missing the celebration. She surprised me by saying she was starting to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about wedding seating. It was about how her new family viewed and would treat our family going forward. The cat incident was just the most obvious symbol of their true feelings. As we talked, a few other relatives came outside, having noticed our absence. They'd witnessed the entire confrontation and wanted to show their support. It turned out several of them had experienced similar treatment throughout the evening, subtle slights and passive-aggressive comments designed to make them feel unwelcome. My uncle mentioned being questioned about his job and income in a way that felt more like an interrogation than polite conversation. My cousin had been criticized for her dress choice, with thinly veiled comments about appropriateness and taste. A pattern was emerging that went far beyond my individual experience. My sister listened to these accounts with growing dismay. Her perfect wedding day was revealing itself as something much more complicated, a social battleground where her new family was systematically asserting dominance over her biological family. Update 2. Inside, we could hear the reception continuing, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Other guests were clearly talking about what had happened, and the celebratory atmosphere had shifted to something more gossipy and charged. My sister made a decision that surprised everyone. She said she needed to go back inside and address the situation directly with her husband and his mother. This was her wedding, her family being disrespected, and she couldn't let it continue unchallenged. I offered to leave quietly to avoid causing more drama, but she refused. She said if I left now, it would send a message that this kind of treatment was acceptable. Instead, she wanted me to come back inside with her and take a proper seat at the family table where I belonged. We walked back into the reception together, and I could feel the energy in the room shift again. Conversations quieted as people noticed our return, wondering how this family drama would resolve itself. My sister moved with new determination, no longer the hesitant bride trying to keep everyone happy. She approached the head table where her husband and his mother were having an intense, whispered conversation. The confrontation that followed was quieter than the earlier scene, but somehow more impactful. My sister calmly but firmly explained that her family would be treated with respect or the celebration would end immediately. Her husband's initial response was to try to smooth things over without taking sides, but my sister had found her voice. She told him that this was a defining moment in their marriage. How he handled his mother's behavior toward her family would set the tone for everything that followed. The mother-in-law attempted to maintain her position, claiming she'd done nothing wrong and that I had overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. But with multiple witnesses and the obvious symbolism of the cat's seating arrangement, her denials sounded increasingly hollow. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. My sister's husband finally stepped up and told his mother that her behavior was unacceptable. He'd apparently been aware of her pattern of subtle cruelties, but had chosen to ignore it rather than confront her. The public nature of this incident had forced his hand. The mother-in-law's reaction was swift and dramatic. She threatened to leave the reception immediately, clearly expecting her son to choose her side over his new wife's family. It was a power play that had probably worked countless times before in smaller family disputes. But this time was different. Her son told her that if she couldn't treat his wife's family with basic respect, perhaps it would be better if she did leave. The words seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else, but once spoken, he stood by them. The silence that followed was deafening. This was clearly not the outcome the mother-in-law had expected. She'd overplayed her hand, assuming her position as mother would give her unlimited power over family dynamics. Instead, she'd forced a choice that didn't go her way. She gathered her things and left the reception, taking several of her friends and relatives with her. The exodus created another wave of drama, but this time my sister seemed relieved rather than distressed. She'd chosen her family over keeping an artificial peace. Update 3. The reception continued with a noticeably different energy. Without the underlying tension of the mother-in-law's presence, people seemed more relaxed and genuine. My sister looked happier than she had all evening, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. I was seated at the family table with proper place settings and even got to meet the famous cat, who turned out to be surprisingly friendly. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the pet had better initial treatment than the bride's brother, but now we could laugh about it rather than seethe. The evening progressed much more smoothly after that. The speeches were heartfelt, the dancing was energetic, and the family photos actually included all of the family. My sister and her husband seemed more united than before, having weathered their first major test as a married couple. During the father-daughter dance, my sister caught my eye and mouthed "thank you" across the room. She later explained that my refusal to accept the disrespectful treatment had given her permission to stand up for herself and set boundaries she should have established months earlier. The gift I'd almost taken home ended up being presented after all, and my sister seemed genuinely touched that I'd stayed to celebrate with her. The crystal vase set would serve as a reminder not just of her wedding day, but of the importance of standing up for family dignity. As the evening wound down, several relatives thanked me for not backing down earlier. They admitted they'd experienced similar treatment, but hadn't felt comfortable speaking up at a wedding. My willingness to make waves had validated their own feelings and experiences. My sister's husband approached me during the last dance, looking somewhat sheepish. He apologized for his mother's behavior and thanked me for forcing him to address issues he'd been avoiding. He admitted that his conflict avoidance had enabled her treatment of his wife's family. The wedding that had started as a beautiful celebration descended into family warfare and emerged as something stronger and more honest. My sister had learned early in her marriage that she could count on her husband to support her when it mattered, even against his own mother. Looking back, I realized that my moment of anger and defiance had been necessary. Sometimes family dynamics need to be disrupted before they can be healed. The trash can comment might have been harsh, but it sparked conversations that needed to happen. The whole experience taught me that standing up for yourself doesn't always ruin relationships. Sometimes it saves them. My sister's marriage started with clear boundaries and mutual respect rather than buried resentments and enabling behavior. That seemed like a much stronger foundation for the future. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how quickly things had changed. A day that could have ended with permanent family division instead concluded with stronger bonds and clearer communication. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. The wedding became family legend, but not for the reasons anyone expected. It wasn't remembered for the flowers or the food or the music, but for the day everyone learned that respect isn't negotiable, even at celebrations.